What's going on, everybody? So before we get to the topic of PCr resynthesis, we're going to take it back to ATP hydrolysis. So we'll start out with an ATP molecule, then we'll have H2O, and what that'll produce is an ADP, inorganic phosphate, and energy and heat and cell work. So basically this is how we'll break down ATP. So then getting into PCR and the PCr system, we'll have a phosphocreatine, we'll have an ADP at the beginning of the process, and then because of an enzyme called creatine kinase referring to that it takes a phosphate from one molecule, giving it to another molecule, which in this term is going to be the phosphate from the phosphocreatine, giving it to the ADP. So then in return, we'll get an ATP molecule plus a creatine. So with this process, we'll get that ATP plus the creatine, so we'll have that work. But now, how do we resynthesize this? How do we get this back to this so we can create this again and be able to repeat the process when we're in activity? So what happens is we'll get this ATP and that'll go to do work. So what will happen is we'll get two ADPs and what will happen is that one of these ADPs is going to give its phosphate to ADP so that it could create ATP. So what we'll get is ATP plus an AMP, which means a monophosphate, so it only has one phosphate instead of two, because it gave it to the ADP, the other ADP, to produce ATP. So what will happen is this ATP is not going to be used to be put to work. What will happen is it'll go over here with a free creatine from the process, and with the help of creatine kinase, again kinase referring to that it gives a phosphate from one molecule to another, and this time around it'll be from the ATP to the creatine, producing phosphocreatine plus an ADP. So here now you're resynthesized. So as you'll notice, it's basically the process that I wrote before, but now backwards. So this process occurs both ways. You start with a PCR or with phosphocreatine and an ADP, and what happens with creatine kinase, you'll phosphorylate the ADP, get ATP and a free creatine, but to resynthesize it, ADP plus ADP will create ATP and an AMP. This ATP will come over here, bond with the free creatine, and then because of the help of creatine kinase, you'll get resynthesis of PCR and ADP, and now you're able to return to activity and perform the activity at hand.